Thank you. My name is Lu Guoqiang from China, China Ministry of Environment. Thank you for your presentation. You just mentioned that the EIB, you may know that recently China joined EIB as formally as a shareholder or donor, just recently.
No, you joined EBRD, not EIB.
Oh, that's different.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Okay. As you mentioned in your presentation that 10% of your investment is outside EU. Mm-hmm. Okay, my question first is China projects included in your business? Second is, you mentioned that you're attracting new partners. My question is, what type of Chinese partners you would like to attract into your program? I mean, the Chinese government agency or Chinese banks or Chinese project owners? Thank you.
So, as I mentioned, I think you've become shareholder of EBRD, which is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, based headquartered in London. And we are shareholders in EBRD ourselves. But they do similar work to us, except that they're more region focused. In terms of our financing, yes, we do finance in China. We've got the mandate for China is climate change. So the projects, we've got quite a few forestry projects in China and energy efficiency projects in China. In terms of strategic partners, I mean, when we talk about strategic partners, it depends in where we are looking at. I mean, we form strategic partnerships with organizations like the Nature Conservancy, for example, with the European Environment Agency and Eurostat, because we're looking at a number of valuation work, but also with other peer institutions. And we certainly have been looking at, let's say, the multilateral development banking community has been looking at forming strategic partnerships with the new Asia Infrastructure Bank, for example. And by forming these strategic partnerships, I think we can certainly, I think Anders mentioned, I don't know how many trillions of dollars there is in infrastructure. In trying to promote sustainable infrastructure, that is an entry point certainly for taking into account and mainstreaming biodiversity. So those strategic partnerships, whether it's at government level or with other commercial banks or China Exim, for example, as an ECA, we certainly would look at that positively.
Thank you, Eva. We have quite a lot of questions. 1, 2, and I think 3. Yeah, okay.
Good morning. My name is Vesa Oksanen from Nora Bank. And Nordea is a large commercial bank operating in the Nordic countries. And I have a, let's say, practical comment about green bonds. Let's just start from the observation that so far no green bonds have been issued in Finland. So, I mean, perhaps we have a possibility to change that situation. There are probably several potential issuers in Finland. Our part might be that we have capabilities to arrange green bonds, and we have done that in some other countries, but not in Finland so far. So I'm just encouraging people to contact us if you want to explore that possibility. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Amy Frankel with the CBD Secretariat. You spoke about how there is not a lot of money being invested in biodiversity, and I've also heard this with the ADB, and I'm sure some others. My question is, what's the issue, and what could be done to increase the flows to those projects, especially when we're here listening to efforts to improve, let's say, the production sources, the farmers, et cetera. So what could be done to better get to support for those kinds of producers who are actually trying to do more sustainable agriculture, etc.?
I think there's very little being put into what I would call pure biodiversity projects, pure conservation projects, because they are difficult to actually make the case for unless it's grant financing, right? It's difficult to find the return on those projects. So the key here is to mainstream actually biodiversity into the other sectors, whether it's infrastructure, water, transport. I think you are aware that at the Inter-American Development Bank and ADB both are cooperating in order to come up with good guidance on sustainable transport, integrating biodiversity considerations. And I think that's our entry point. We are project financing institutions. We finance large infrastructure, let's face it, and in energy, infrastructure, agriculture, processing. So as climate is also cross-cutting, biodiversity is a cross-cutting issue. And so we need to actually leverage the biodiversity component in those projects a lot better and actually give it the visibility it requires. So I think that's where the problem lies.
Thanks, Eva. There's another question online, actually, that touches on this, and it also asks, are the financial needs for biodiversity and for implementing the biodiversity targets expressed clearly enough? And Frank, you touched on this earlier. So indeed, there is a point that you have to mainstream in other sectors, like you say, Eva, but I guess you also need to have the biodiversity targets in there clearly expressed. And Frank, do you want to, or?
I'll just say, I mean, climate is a target, and usually, it's not a climate project per se. Sometimes especially in adaptation, it's an incremental or a component of a larger project, right? Financial needs, I think it was Frank, or I can't remember, or Anders who said there is a lot of money out there. The question is, where do you find good bankable projects? And that's the issue. And if as Frank said, there's no invoice, it's very hard for a financial institution to be able to invest in a project. But I'll let Frank.
I was at the World Parks Congress last year in Sydney, which was a phenomenally great event. For one reason, we didn't have to decide on anything. It wasn't like a COP. We could actually just, like here, have a good discussion. But, you look at our protected areas program around the world, as wonderful as it is, we've actually designed our protected areas so they can't generate revenues. I was calling it the World Poverty Congress because our parks are broke. And one of the reasons they're broke is they don't have sales, maybe a little bit of tourism, and that's it. And so when you look at other landscape users out there, agriculture, timber, mining, as I say, golf courses, whatever, those potentially can generate revenues that could then maybe in part be spent on biodiversity conservation. So maybe we need to start looking more actively at where flows of revenues actually are occurring and see if we can, as Eva just said, mainstream biodiversity into those flows. And then maybe down the road, even some of those flows can help with our protected area system. I'm not suggesting our protected area system should disappear, but we've set up a system in which it's, parks are based on grants, on subsidy. They don't have they don't have sales. They don't sell goods and services. So it's not the only solution. We had the question about plastics. It's not an investment thing. There's a lot of different areas of finance, and there's a need for grant finance. But there are lots of actors on our landscape beyond parks that if we could get biodiversity more actively integrated as a criteria for investment, we could generate ways in which some of the revenues coming out of those areas, the sale of agricultural products, the sale of livestock, the sale of tourism, could be used to conserve nature and to maintain ecosystem services, etc.
Thanks, Frank. And indeed, for this mainstreaming, it's important to have biodiversity criteria that are clearly defined. And you showed some with the performance standard and the verified conservation areas. These can also always be further refined, of course, but they are very good first steps for building biodiversity indicators, because indeed everybody, all ecologists would tell you that it's a challenge, and it is a challenge because there's so many. We have 2 questions in the audience, please. The gentleman at the top, and then one more.
You've actually answered my question, but I'm Kirben Naika from South Africa, and I just feel that we're still pursuing financing for natural capital in silos, the climate and biodiversity. I mean, if you look at JEF funding, for example, you know, it's mobilizing resources towards climate, and then there's a whole lot of criteria for biodiversity, and then there's for desertification as well. So my take is that surely there is co-benefits, you know, from financing climate, from financing sustainability projects as well, and we need to actually look at the co-benefits and the resource flows towards the biodiversity sector. Thanks.
And one more question at the bottom, yeah, in the center.
Matt Smith, JNCC, or Joint Nature Conservation Committee in the United Kingdom. Firstly, thank you very much for some excellent presentations there. I've got a number of questions, but I should pose one to Ms. Meyerhofer. Throughout this conference, we've seen various mechanisms that have been developed to account for natural capital, ecosystem services, and we've also heard that biodiversity and ecosystems are a common good, delivering benefits to not just EU citizens, but citizens throughout the world. And what seems to me is a lot of these mechanisms are trying to retrofit this thinking into an economic system which has particular flaws for accounting for the ecosystems which we all rely on. And it was interesting to see that UNEP have come up with this new potential economic systems. So my question is, you're talking very much about not being able to put European money into projects that don't offer a return on investment from natural capital and ecosystem services, irrespective of them giving off, well, supporting life on this planet. Do you think that there'll ever be a shift in the view of investment banks, financial mechanisms, where they would just invest in doing what's right rather than what's going to turn on investment? And if so, how long do you think that shift in thinking will take?
Very philosophical. Is there a shift in doing what's right? I think there has been a shift. Certainly, I mean, with public financial institutions, because of not only pressures from civil society, but also because the mandates are different from, let's say, commercial financial institutions, and through the application of, call them safeguard policy standards, whatever you will, there has been a shift. However, we all set up to promote economic growth, job creation, and at the moment, I mean, the EIB is I'm having an issue with my own management or senior management, is because their mandate right now, they're under political pressure to deliver more jobs and get Europe out of the crisis. So how do you do that? And if I come here with my biodiversity and say, we need to increase flows in biodiversity, the president of the EIB goes and says, okay, if you can demonstrate that your flows are going to generate employment and economic growth, fine. But otherwise, it's infrastructure. But I think within a regulated environment, I think there has to be a partnership between the private sector, the financial sector, and the policy makers. And I think without that connection, without a change in the system, you're not going to have what you're asking for doing what's right. And there has to be also a systemic, I think Anders mentioned, a systemic change in the way we work. We can't go on as business as usual. The change has happened, but it's in silos and it's pockets. And I think we are slowly getting there on climate, but we are far off on biodiversity, unfortunately. And it's just because it's not as tangible as climate. Anders, yeah, go ahead.
And just to ask Anders also, because this comes with, of course, with your presentation, and there was a question earlier online, will there be a win-win situation when we undertake valuation to fill that knowledge gap that's needed by financial institutions and the public sector to make that shift?
Well, I'd like to focus on this question because I think it's very interesting. What is right? Is it right to have zero return on your pension plan if you're doing really, really good returns for the environment? I mean, let's have a show of hands. How many people would want zero return on your pension plan if it has tremendous environmental benefits? One person. Thank you. So clearly, the finance industry has a certain purpose, and that is to generate returns on assets. Now, right now, a lot of these returns are generated in a way that is negative for the environment. So what we need to do is to shift that investment without giving up too much or indeed any return, or maybe even having more positive return. We need to shift it into more green. We need banks like Nordea to have a biodiversity assessment of every single lending operation that they do and see whether it has a positive or negative impact. And maybe you do. I know that there are some banks out there that do that. We need to perhaps, conservation finance, restoration finance is very important, but it is so tied to a public good that it's difficult for the private finance industry to find the necessary revenue stream, at least at a scale, in order to build those types of assets and also make them replicable. It might work in one area, but the same thing might not work in other areas due to all of the, there are so many things that need to come together for these types of projects to work with, civil society, local governance, local stakeholders. So I think that what we are seeing and should be seeing is not the expectation that finance will, I don't think there's a trade-off between finance and environment. I think you need a shift in finance to better environment, and that's where you'll get the positive impact on climate, biodiversity, ecosystems, and social issues also. Let's not forget those.
Thanks. And Frank, you'd like to add something to that?
Just one quick statement. I think it's important that when we're talking here about private sector investment, to also remember that this whole agenda does have a big element of it that requires public subsidy, public grants. And I said earlier about our parks being poor. They're poor because our governments aren't putting the money they need into it. And maybe that's because we as citizens aren't telling our governments to do that. I read the head of state's responses to the SDG goals. What a thing to do, just read through all those statements in the UN in September. Only Norway mentioned 14 and 15. The goals on nature. The governments aren't even talking about the nature goals at the high level. They're talking about climate, of course. That's very sexy. But our goals on biodiversity for public support just aren't even on the agenda hardly. So I do think that in addition to what we're talking about here, scaling up private sector opportunities for financing biodiversity, there's a whole other discussion about public sector support and the need to maintain and increase that for the public aspects of our agenda, specifically parks.
And yeah, indeed, this This shift from climate change to biodiversity might be far. Maybe it won't happen. Maybe it will always be climate change, and there will be just a way to address climate change with biodiversity, because of course the two are highly dependent on each other. We have a question over there, and then a few more to address online.
Hi, Brent Matthias. I'm from the University of Helsinki. I work mostly in valuation of ecosystem services and also the risks associated with those valuations. My question is, it's kind of been going around now in the last little bit that there are these co-benefits, and actually the trade-offs between managing for biodiversity and climate change are quite low. But you said that it was hard to kind of get the mainstreaming of this idea of biodiversity. My perception of banks has always been that they are involved in risk management. And to me, biodiversity is a risk management strategy. It kind of increases the resilience of your investment and reduces the exposure to, for example, climatic risks. Why is that so difficult of a message to kind of get forward within a bank? And then, sorry, I have a second kind of smaller follow-up question. So in the first presentation, there was kind of this discussion about companies such as mining and oil and gas getting involved in biodiversity recognition in their projects. What is the boundary within those projects? Because to me, there's this question of indirect effects, especially with climatic effects, that once you start feeding those into the actual biodiversity impacts, it kind of seems questionable to me. So yeah, maybe if you could kind of expand on that. Thanks.
I'll take the first, I'll leave the second to Frank. Although I should be able to answer that too. In terms of, yes, risk management is not the issue. I mean, we are in the business of risk management, and biodiversity is, as Frank also said, very much of PS6 or even our standards is how to manage any risk on impacts to biodiversity. But a project, whether you're talking about large infrastructure, is going to have a negative impact on biodiversity. What we are looking at is mainstreaming biodiversity to have a positive impact on biodiversity, meaning going beyond no net loss, but going towards positive gains. And that additionality is the difficult one. It's not ensuring no net loss through the application of standards. There are difficulties, of course, and applying the mitigation hierarchy doesn't come without its, complexity. But managing that risk and managing impacts is only one part of the equation. Is how do you go beyond that, be more proactive, and actually increase financial flows to have a positive impact on biodiversity beyond just pure mitigation. In terms of boundaries, and I'll let Frank comment on that, well, all of our standards have area of influence. So looking at, you have the footprint of whether it's a mine or any infrastructure project, and it has to take into account cumulative, indirect, induced impacts, as well as impacts on its area of influence. So the question then comes especially on private sector operations, is how far can the private sector be responsible for that area of influence? Because if we're talking about sometimes ecosystem services, let's say a large dam downstream, can they manage those risks? Are they responsible? Or do they need to then get into partnership with then the government, that the government takes a landscape approach and actually is then responsible for then the area of influence?
Yeah, there's the IFC has something called associated facilities, and they'll look at how, when something comes into a landscape, how does it affect everything else around it? And it's quite interesting, but it doesn't go to the level of, all right, this is an investment in a gas or an oil project, and that has climate change impacts, and climate change impacts lead to whatever desertification and so on. Those types, that level, I don't think the systems are yet robust to sort of put them all in there, but there are some approaches I just don't invest in those areas. So, for example, in the Yemen project I mentioned, it's been done with the IUCN Marine Program. When we met earlier this year with the WWF Marine Program to talk about collaboration, that was a line in the sand for them. You know, we as WWF can't be seen to associate with any, even if it's good biodiversity, anything that's doing with that sector, the oil and gas sector. Okay, well, there you go. There's a foundation in Geneva that's actually trying to set up national parks on top of oil deposits to stop the industry. So there are other approaches. I think with respect to biodiversity at a local level, what these standards are doing that's positive is they're saying whether it's a tobacco farm or it's a mining operation or it's a timber operation or it's a wildlife hunting operation, if they can at least have localized biodiversity positive impacts, that's one aspect. If that then has systemic influences on global issues, that's another level, and then there's another level of policy debate and NGO campaigning around it. So it doesn't solve all the problems, for sure. But at least there is, what I do find very interesting is that these projects and the way these standards are set up is they don't just say, look just on your own little footprint, but look at how your footprint fits into the neighborhood, into the landscape, and what are the other issues and so on. So there's an attempt to have a broader impact than just your own little parking lot, if you will. But it doesn't go all the way to linking, conserving, say, a local habitat with global climate change necessarily.
Thanks, Frank. And indeed, it looks like from today's discussion, which is still ongoing, of course, we've seen that indeed biodiversity is considered when making financial decision-making, but it's more for avoiding the negative impacts, as we've been seeing. But there is a lack of bankable projects, it seems, that would generate positive biodiversity, meaning biodiversity protection and conservation, or biodiversity restoration. So even if investors would sometimes be interested in investing in pro-biodiversity projects, if there's no return, there will be no projects. Luckily, with the Natural Capital Financing Facility, and you mentioned also initiatives from other banks around the world, there are aims to scale this up, and there are some questions coming actually on what is the appetite for the Natural Capital Financing Facility, and are there any bottlenecks?
The appetite is fairly low at the moment. I think we've been working a lot with different stakeholders on trying to bring up their projects to a certain level of maturity and that they are bankable. I think there's still, and I think it's because of the construct and the fact that the Commission funding is coming out of LIFE, and the whole idea, I think, that LIFE is grant funding. So a lot of projects that have been put forward to us were expecting a grant, rather than actually, and the moment we ask, well, where's your revenue stream coming from? They go, oh, I'm supposed to generate revenue. And say, yes. And then they have to go back to the drawing board, and sometimes it's not possible. I think the bottleneck is really an understanding of what exactly is a bankable project and where is my cash flow coming from. And that a lot of organizations or even privates can't get their head around. So.
Absolutely. And while the discussion goes on, please, I invite you to vote by sending an SMS or by voting in the link, online on the link above. To what percentage are you willing to give up return on your investments for environmental returns? We see the votes changing live as more and more people are participating. We'll pay attention to the results in about 5 minutes. To go back to the discussions, there was a question earlier at the top over there, and then 1, 2 more.
Martin Hollins from BirdLife International. There was a lot of discussion yesterday on the scale of externalities. There's been a lot of discussion on how to reduce the impact side of that, but a lot of the things today seem to be pointing at one of the other major gaps, which is how you actually internalize the need to pay for ecosystem services. So rather than the comment that we should expect investors to give up any return, don't we need to do more to see how to actually have a cash flow from payment for ecosystem services? And if so, is that best through the indirect mechanism of taxation and then governments paying for these, or do direct payments seem a better way forward? Thank you.
Who would like?
I mean, we in our project where we looked at water stress, we put a price on water stress in all over the globe, and this is just to take this opportunity to plug the project. Also, this is an Excel model that's available on our website. It's freely downloadable, so you can put in a latitude and longitude and get a price for water at any land-based location all over the world. And I mean, in discussions with our financial institutions, we talked about, you know, how could these externalities or this specific externality be internalized, and we went with a price which would, I think in this model, be a price that regulators would put on the company. Whether that is the best solution, whether taxation is better, or whether simply restricting supply and creating a market-based mechanism like carbon trading, I don't really know. I think it depends on the specific indicator, and I think it depends on the area where it's in, whether certain types of price internalization mechanisms are feasible in areas due to governance and other issues, whether there is enough of a communication between market players in order to have a tradable mechanism, if there is sufficient strong governance to have a tax system in place. So I don't think there is a simple answer to that, and I don't think there is one answer to it. And that might be an unsatisfactory answer, but it's not a simple world. So.
We had another question down here.
And I am Eda from Mexico, from the Ministry of the Environment. I have to return to the previous discussion. I wanted to know if you have criteria to prioritize projects to finance, because environmental impact assessment in a local and regional approach is mandatory in different countries. So if we are building up a very strong environmental legal framework for the projects to do better in terms of biodiversity conservation, not raw conservation, but not impacting biodiversity by, for example, infrastructure development, how is the finance sector prioritizing that? Because talking about climate change projects, those projects have a direct impact on biodiversity too. They are not excluded from biodiversity. Wind farms, dams. For example, a dam project in Mexico has to comply with environmental regional impact and has to compensate that. that should be interest to finance, and it has data to make up the revenue and everything. No, how are you considering in prioritizing those projects? Those who do better get more points, or how do you do that?
I don't think we prioritize projects in that way. I mean, all projects have to comply with national regulation. That's a given. And where we see that there may be at times a gap between national regulation in certain countries and our standards, we'll ask the client to actually compensate and fill that gap. The prioritization happens at a much different level, because environment is just one component of the eligibility for the project. There's economic, there's technical, there's financial, there's social, and it also depends on the objective of the project, whether it's a project for supplying energy, if that's the case of the wind farm, so rural electrification, poverty alleviation. I mean, we have different mandates according to the different regions we work in. So the eligibility, the environmental eligibility is just one component. Of course, a project, we can only finance projects that meet those eligibility criteria, and the projects have to be, I'll put that in quotation mark, in line or compliant with our standards. If they're not, they won't pass, they won't be able to be put forward to the board. Unless there are measures or conditions in the finance contract that will address those gaps. So I'm not sure. We won't prioritize according to which country is doing better in terms of national legislation or regulation. That's...
No, it was not my intention to ask if you take into account the compliance with national regulation. My question is more than how are you facing the reality that you cannot separate environmental impact from other elements of sustainability? Because if the finance sector is not taking into account sustainable the three branches of sustainability, how can you create jobs and destroy what the jobs are supposed to, the people with the jobs are supposed to live with? Or how, I know this is a matter of valuation, because how do you value the spiritual criteria for a site that will be covered with a dam?
All right.
And how is this evolving in the financial sector? Because the financial sector is business sector too. So
now I got you. Actually, all these criteria that you've just mentioned are in, whether you take, let's say, the IFC, are in their performance standards. They have 8 performance standards. We have 10. And all these criteria are in different performance requirements and standards. And let's say the multilateral financial institutions have all very similar standards, and these are all taken into account. We perform a due diligence on the project, taking these criteria, whether it's involuntary resettlement, intangible cultural heritage that addresses your spiritual, the whole environmental assessment process, are all encompassed in these different standards. As Frank mentioned, I mean, especially with the IFC performance standards, there's been a much greater outreach, certainly, and influence of these standards with the Equator Principal Banks, those who've all signed up to it, but also with the European Development Financial Institutions, which have all signed up to or use IFC performance standards as their standards to actually assess the quality from an environment, social and economic point of view for the project. So I think that's where I said that the MDBs have a leadership role in setting standards and complementing standards that are being developed also by the private sector. We must not forget the work that the Cross-Sector Biodiversity Initiative has been doing, or ICMM or IPICA, which complement actually the work that we've been carrying out for the last, since we've been actually in existence, really. But Frank, you may want to also.
Can I jump in here and then back to Anders? Is that okay? Okay. The first standard in the IFC standard is a bond environment and social assessment and management. And then the other 7 are themes: cultural heritage, biodiversity, labor, employment conditions, and so on. So when I've been involved in these audits, the very first thing you're doing is you're auditing an environmental and social impact assessment against the standard. So you're looking at how the company is assessing its impacts, and then you're looking at the standards and saying the standards want you to do tick, 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 tick. Have they done it? Have they not done it? Have they looked at the issues? So it is very integrated. And the social, when you get to a word like ecosystem services, the social and the biodiversity go like this. They have to, because you're dealing with communities and their needs and water and air quality and so on. The challenge is that you can do a lot of that at the assessment level, and obviously the bankers are very interested in the assessment level, but when you turn from just assessing the situation to setting up the management system, it becomes more challenging. And so oftentimes the first thing then will be to look at not just the environmental and social impact assessment, but the first steps of the environmental and social management plan of the company in the construction phase. So they'll talk about a biodiversity or a social action plan at the construction phase. And then you go into the operations phase. And the IFC standards so far are quite good at going from assessment to the construction phase and looking at that and saying, what are the impacts, how do we address them, and so on. When you get to the operations phase of these projects, which are really important for biodiversity, a long time, and for local communities and so on, then it sort of fades a little bit, because if you think the investors will get their money out somewhere in that phase, and they're gone. They've mitigated the risk and off they go. So we still have a challenge there. When you get to the end of the life cycle of the project, when you get to decommissioning and closure, it's interesting, the IFC standard only mentions decommissioning once or twice in the whole standard. It's not quite there yet. Some sectors, like mining, are very focused on decommissioning because they have to clean up their mess when they're done and everybody knows it. Others, offshore oil and gas platforms, a little less focused, a little less clear. So there's still a lot of work to be done. But I think what you've got is an attempt with these standards to do a real integrated social environmental look at what the situation is at the assessment, and at least at the initial years of the management of the project, to see if it's going to have a robust management plan that can lead towards net positive impact in both environmental and social terms. The project has to make money, but it has to be good for the society, and it has to be good for the environment, ideally. That's the aim.
Thanks, Frank. You've shed light on an important issue that beyond having the standards, it's important to have enforcement and audit to make sure that it's not only on paper, but it's also there on site and over time. I'd just like to come back to the poll. It looks like under 50% is what people are willing up to give in their return on investment if they know that it has a positive environmental benefit. In order to interpret this, I guess it would mean that if you have something that would give you a 5% return on investment, most people here are ready to take something with a 3% return on investment, let's say, as long as they know that it has a positive environmental return. So judging by this survey, it's not a huge sample size, but at least it's in the, over 50, under 100. There is a market out there for investments with positive environmental returns. We had 2 more questions. I'm sorry that some time has passed. One was on the right here. Yes. Oh, well, sorry. It's okay.
Thank you, Warwick from South Africa. I mean, it's been answered on the wall. I just try to offer up a solution around changing the language. It was mentioned yesterday, and I think it's a bit of a pet project of mine. Is that biodiversity, green economy, even natural capital is very poorly understood, and as a solution to the outcome of this forum, I think we need to think around innovative ways of changing the language that people will understand.
We have one more comment there and another question. Sorry, it's Marion. Yeah.
Thank you. Marion from Global Nature Fund. I represent the NGOs in various ISO gremiums in Germany, and one of them is about smart infrastructures, because now ISO is developing a management standard for sustainable development in communities, and a lot of sub-standards and within smart infrastructure. So in my gremium, there are many representatives of big companies like Siemens, Daimler, etc., and of course also representatives of the municipalities and cities, and NGOs, and we tried hard to include green infrastructures in the concept of smart infrastructures. And we noted that the businesses, at least which are represented there, are not interested at all in green infrastructures. The only one who is interested are the NGOs and the authorities, the local authorities, because yes, they see, let me say, the return of investment, starting to see the return of investment, looking at green infrastructures as an alternative to grey infrastructures, brown infrastructures, etc. And my question is, I see there a big target group for investment in ecosystem services, green infrastructures, etc. And yesterday we heard that the public authorities are a big buyer, a big procurement target group. And what is your impression as financial institutes, and are you approaching them also in a more active manner to invest in green infrastructures?
Indeed, I mean, the pickup is slow, I agree. We've had more success with the so-called smart cities and with the what is it called? I forgot the name, but where the mayors, the different mayors of the cities have been, the covenant of mayors. That's right. So there, and because we've been integrating requirements for green infrastructure in our financing, there's been a lot more pickup, and we're hoping that as it took some time for energy efficiency and renewable energy, that in the smart infrastructure field this will come about. But it is a requirement actually of looking at alternative ways to grey infrastructure, and so if they approach the bank for financing, they'll be confronted with that issue, and we'll have that dialogue and that discussion. And so we hope that through that dialogue and discussion we'll be able to influence and leverage a better understanding and change in practice. But the pickup is slow.
Thank you. And indeed, this change in language is important, and some terms resonate better with business. Infrastructure is definitely one. Yesterday we saw in the World Business Council's presentation that they've replaced ecosystems with natural infrastructure, and then businesses understand it more. And you have all the different colors of infrastructure, of course, but indeed, some resonate better than others, and the language is indeed important. Now we've gone into coffee time, so it's been really useful discussions. Very, very good to see that there is progress and there's still a lot to do. Coffee is on for 30 minutes? Yeah. Okay. Pass on to Christina.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to remind you to go to this MTK stand on the left about the field trip tomorrow. Thank you.
A round of applause for all the panelists, please. Thanks.